There are moments in history that pass so quietly, so invisibly, that the world never realizes how close it came to falling apart. Moments in which the fate of millions, of nations, families, children, balances on the judgment of a single human being. No cameras, no applause, no monuments waiting to be built. Just one mind, one heartbeat, and a decision that cannot be undone. On a late September night in 1983, during one of the most dangerous points of the Cold War, such a moment occurred. In a dark room filled with screens and buzzing machinery outside Moscow, a man sat at his console, watching the world's most terrifying alarm begin to flash. According to the Soviet early warning system, nuclear missiles had just been launched from the United States. Not one missile, several, enough to start a war that would likely end civilization itself. But instead of panicking, instead of following protocol, instead of acting on fear, this man, an aging lieutenant colonel named Stanislav Petrov, did something astonishing. He waited. In that pause, in that quiet breath, the world was saved. This is the story of the forgotten man who prevented a nuclear apocalypse, the quiet soul who chose reason over fear, and the moment history nearly shattered without anyone knowing. And throughout this journey, you'll discover the strange layers of secrecy, malfunctioning technology, political tension, human judgment, and quiet bravery that form the fragile shield between peace and unimaginable destruction. So breathe in deeply, let calmness settle around you, and step into a night when the world slept peacefully, only because one man refused to believe in the end. Section 1. The Tense World of 1983. A Planet on a Knife's Edge. To understand the magnitude of Petrov's decision, we must first understand the world he inhabited. A world stretched so tightly between fear and retaliation that a single misreading, a single malfunction, could ignite global catastrophe. The year was 1983, and humanity stood at one of the most perilous points of the entire Cold War. You could almost feel the tension in the air, like electricity humming quietly beneath everyday life. It was a time when mistakes were as dangerous as missiles themselves. The United States and the Soviet Union had built vast arsenals of nuclear weapons, enough to obliterate the planet many times over. These weapons weren't just theoretical tools of war. They were active, humming, ready to be deployed at a moment's notice. Nuclear submarines patrolled the oceans. Fighter jets crouched on runways 24 hours a day. Massive early warning systems, satellites, radars, computers, watched the skies like anxious guardians. The entire world lived inside a machine designed for instant retaliation. In both superpowers, political distrust reached neo-paranoid levels. U.S. President Ronald Reagan had called the Soviet Union an evil empire, a phrase that echoed through newspapers and television screens like a threat. The Soviets, for their part, believed the United States was preparing for a surprise attack. Leaders on both sides were convinced the other was capable of striking first, and every single time a military exercise, a radar reflection, or a communication glitch occurred, somewhere deep within command centers, blood pressure rose and hands hovered over buttons. But 1983 wasn't merely tense, it was uniquely dangerous. Early that year, Reagan announced the Strategic Defense Initiative, a missile shield the Soviets viewed as a possible first step toward a real nuclear war. That spring, massive NATO exercises simulated coordinated nuclear strikes in Europe, which the Kremlin believed might be a cover for an imminent attack. In September, just weeks before Petrov's fateful night, the Soviets shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007, thinking it was a U.S. spy plane. Tensions skyrocketed. At the same time, technology was evolving faster than military doctrine. Early warning satellites, filled with experimental software and untested algorithms, were trusted with the unimaginable responsibility of detecting incoming missiles. Yet these systems were not perfect. They could misread sunlight reflections, cloud formations, or infrared flares. The fear of malfunction was real and well known, but it didn't change the brutal truth. If a warning appeared, protocol demanded reaction, fast. Cold War strategy at the time relied on something called launch on warning. That meant if one side believed the other had launched nuclear missiles, they were expected to fire their own weapons before the enemy missiles even landed. The logic was chilling but simple. If you waited to confirm the attack, it might be too late to respond. This doctrine left almost no time for reflection, discussion, or human judgment. Seconds mattered. Hesitation could mean annihilation. In military bunkers across both nations, officers were trained to trust the machines. Radar did not panic. Satellites did not make emotional mistakes. Computers did not hesitate. Humans, in comparison, were fallible and slow. And yet humans were still required, because machines could detect, calculate, and predict, but they could not decide. That responsibility remained terrifyingly human. This was the world Stanislav Petrov lived in, a world where the wrong pixel on a satellite image could lead to the end of civilization, a world where nations built systems so powerful and fear-driven that one man's choice in a dimly lit command room could alter the fate of millions. Every day, officers like Petrov carried this burden quietly. They went to work knowing that if the machines ever screamed attack, protocol demanded immediate action. They were trained not to question, not to reflect, but to follow the chain of command, swiftly, decisively, and without hesitation. After all, in nuclear warfare, a delayed response could mean defeat. Yet beneath the rigid protocols, beneath the flashing lights and mechanical warnings, there always remained a crucial truth, one that would become the heartbeat of Petrov's decision. Machines could detect signals, but only humans could interpret them. And because of that, the entire world unknowingly depended on the calm judgment of a man almost no one outside Russia had ever heard of. On that fateful night, Petrov took his seat inside the Supyukov 15 command center, an isolated, heavily protected bunker filled with screens and tension. He had no idea that within hours, history would place the weight of the world on his shoulders. For now, he was just another officer on duty, another pair of eyes trained to watch for the unthinkable. The room around him hummed with low conversation, quiet footsteps, and the soft pulse of machinery. Everyone inside that bunker understood their role and the sheer danger of their responsibility. Outside, the world slept peacefully. Inside, the world was one alarm away from ending. Section 2. The alarming night of September 26, 1983. The story continues on a night that would quietly carve its place into the deepest folds of history. September 26, 1983. Inside the Serpukhov 15 bunker south of Moscow. This moment wasn't dramatic in the ways we expect from movies. There were no alarms blaring like in Hollywood scenes, no soldiers sprinting through red-lit corridors, no frantic shouting. Instead, it began with something far more unsettling: stillness. The bunker always hummed in a low, constant vibration. Air recycling units, computer racks, distant generators, and the muffled buzz of radar equipment. For the people stationed there, this steady humming became comforting background noise, a reminder that the guardians of the early warning system were surrounded by machinery designed to protect their nation. But on this night, the hum felt heavier, as if the room itself was holding its breath. Stanislav Petrov, thin, slightly tired, yet perpetually alert, sat before a bank of monitors, reflecting pale light across his features. He was trained to identify the unthinkable, signs of a U.S. nuclear launch. His duty was simple on paper, but impossible in reality. If the system reported an attack, he needed to verify it and immediately pass the information up the chain of command. Within minutes, Soviet leadership would decide whether to launch a retaliatory strike. The fate of hundreds of millions rested on seconds. Petrov had worked many shifts like this, yet this one felt different. The political climate between the United States and the USSR had reached one of its most hostile peaks since the Cuban Missile Crisis. NATO was conducting aggressive military exercises in Europe. Soviet leadership feared a surprise American attack. Tensions were razor sharp, so much so that a single wrong assumption could ignite a global catastrophe. And then it happened. Without warning, the warning siren erupted, a sharp, metallic scream slicing through the bunker. Red lights began flashing. On the central monitor, a word appeared in bright, chilling letters: launch. Missile detected. Petrov froze, not from panic, but from a brief moment of disbelief. His training kicked in instantly. He rose from his chair, leaning toward the screen, noting the system details. According to the satellite-based detection program known as OCO, the United States had launched a nuclear missile from one of its silos. One missile, one glowing dot on the screen. Petrov felt something twist inside him. One missile was unusual. U.S. strategy assumed that if America ever struck first, it would not be with a single warhead. It would be a massive barrage to overwhelm Soviet defenses. So why only one? His team looked at him, breath held, waiting. Soldiers stiffened, fingers poised over communication relays. Procedure was clear. Confirm the warning to the Soviet High Command. They would then prepare a counterstrike. But Petrov didn't speak. He stared at the screen again. Something felt wrong. And then the second alarm burst. A second missile. And then a third. A fourth. A fifth. Within a minute, the system was reporting 5 U.S. intercontinental ballistic missiles headed toward the Soviet Union. The room shifted. Air felt suffocating. The bunker's dim lights seemed to flicker under the tension. This was no longer a glitch. It looked like an attack. 5 warheads would be enough to devastate multiple strategic targets. Soviet protocol demanded immediate escalation. Officers waited for Petrov's confirmation. His one sentence would travel through secure lines directly to the Kremlin, possibly triggering the launch of thousands of Soviet missiles in response. The entire world, without knowing it, was suspended above a cliff, balanced on Petrov's next breath. He analyzed the incoming data again. He checked system diagnostics. He questioned technicians. The satellite signals seemed authentic. The computer system wasn't malfunctioning, at least not visibly. But deeper inside, Petrov felt a small, quiet intuition that the machine might be wrong. He thought about the Americans. If they wanted to destroy the Soviet Union in a first strike, they would not fire 5 missiles. That made no military sense. It felt too small, too clean, too deliberate. He had seconds left. His mind moved through everything he knew: political tensions, the reliability of the Oko satellite system, the nature of nuclear strategy, the risks of being wrong. If he dismissed it and the attack was real, millions of his people would die. If he reported it and it was false, he would help unleash a nuclear apocalypse that no one could undo. And yet, he chose to trust human judgment over machine logic. With a slow exhale, steadying himself, he delivered the words that defied the system. This is a false alarm. No panic. No hesitation, just conviction. His team stared at him, stunned. The red lights still flashed. The computer still insisted the missiles were real. But Petrov held firm. Minutes dragged by, longer than any minutes he had ever lived. And then the truth revealed itself. No missiles appeared on radar. Nothing entered Soviet territory. There had been no attack. A satellite had mistaken sunlight reflecting off clouds for missile launches. The system was flawed, and Petrov had seen through it. History would continue forward, quietly unaware that one man's calm intuition in a dim bunker had prevented the destruction of the world. The calmest man on Earth had faced the loudest danger, and silence had been his victory. This sentence can later serve as your most interesting sentence if needed. ... Section 3. The hidden flaws of a system built to never fail. To understand the magnitude of what Stanislav Petrov faced that night, we need to travel deeper, not into the bunker, but into the system behind it. A system that was supposed to be perfect. A system that was built with the belief that machines could see the world more clearly than humans. A system that, on one quiet September night, proved it did not understand the sky as well as it should have. This section isn't just about the technology. It's about the illusion of certainty, and how fragile that illusion becomes when life on Earth depends on it. A new era of warning, the Oko system. By 1983, the Soviet Union was racing to modernize its early warning infrastructure. The Americans had satellites that could detect missile launches, and the Soviets needed their own version, something fast, reliable, and able to see over the curve of the Earth long before ground-based radars picked up anything. Thus came Oko, a satellite constellation designed to track the infrared signatures of American missile launches. Oko was built quickly, under pressure, and with immense political expectations. It had the aura of being cutting edge, but behind the scenes, engineers knew it still suffered from blind spots. Instead of being stationed directly above American silos, the satellites were placed in highly elliptical orbits. This gave them sweeping, dramatic views of the Earth, but also problematic angles where sunlight, cloud layers, and atmospheric distortions could all mimic heat signatures. In other words, Oko was a technological miracle, but a fragile one. Still, it was treated with reverence. A machine that would never lie, a machine that had no emotions, a machine that would not hesitate when human lives were on the line. That's what made the events of September 26 so unnerving. The system staked everything on being right, while knowing it might be wrong. The fragile marriage between satellites and sunlight. On the night of the false alarm, one of the Oko satellites found itself aligned in a specific, rare orientation. The rising sun, the angled clouds above the American Midwest, and the satellite's optical sensors lined up perfectly. It was a coincidence so rare that engineers hadn't fully accounted for it. The thin, high-altitude clouds, cirrus clouds stretched into delicate threads, caught the sunlight like a shimmering mirror. The reflection, viewed from the satellite's perspective, had the same signature pattern as a missile launch plume rising from a silo. Here's the quiet irony. The system wasn't malfunctioning at all. It was doing exactly what it had been programmed to do. It just didn't understand nature's tricks. For the satellite, the glowing streak was identical to a missile. The computer processed the light as heat. Heat meant launch. Launch meant attack. It didn't question, it didn't reflect. It simply allowed physics to dictate meaning. And because the stakes were so high, even a single false reading was treated as a potential apocalypse in motion. Why the system believed itself completely. The most dangerous part of the Oko platform was not its sensors. It was the confidence built around them. Engineers had warned that the satellite constellation was incomplete, not yet fully calibrated, and prone to interference. But military doctrine demanded certainty. Wars are not fought on hesitation, nor on doubt, and so the system was woven into the command chain as if it were flawless. When it reported the first missile, the computer instantly categorized the signal as high reliability. The alarm that sounded in the bunker wasn't a gentle suggestion. It was a digital scream of conviction. The system presented Petrov with a simple, chilling message: launch, high confidence. Machines are believed because they do not panic. They do not imagine things. They do not let emotions cloud judgment. But on that night, the machine imagined heat on clouds, mistook reflections for rockets, and created a vision of war out of sunlight. And it believed itself absolutely. Petrov, however, did not. The broken bridge between data and meaning. One of the greatest myths of the Cold War was the belief that more data automatically meant more truth. But data without context is just noise. The Oko satellite saw something, but it could not understand what it meant. It could not ask, why only one missile at first? Why would the U.S. launch a small attack instead of an overwhelming strike? Could natural phenomena mimic missile signatures? Could the system itself be feeding false information? Petrov asked all of these questions in seconds. The machine asked none. This gap, the space between detection and interpretation, is what saved the world. The system could see light. Petrov could see logic. The system saw patterns. Petrov saw strategy. The system saw risk. Petrov saw inconsistency. He realized something no computer could be programmed to understand. The scenario simply didn't make sense. It didn't follow the logic of war. The Americans wouldn't launch a small 5-missile strike. It would accomplish nothing except guaranteeing retaliation. The satellite story did not match reality. And that was the difference between believing the data and understanding the world. Why the satellite alone could not be trusted. The Soviet High Command had developed a philosophy known as dual confirmation. A missile launch should be detected both by satellites above and by ground-based radar below. But radar can only detect things once they rise above the horizon. By the time a missile reached that height, the Soviet leadership would have only minutes left, too little time to make informed decisions. That's why the satellite's early detection carried such weight. It was seen as the final line of warning before the point of no return. On most nights, that system was a comfort. On this night, it became a threat. Petrov knew radar had not shown any incoming missiles. That alone made the satellite warning suspicious. But the protocol didn't allow him to simply ignore a satellite reading. He had to justify his doubt. He had to stand against a machine that everyone else trusted. This wasn't just a technological flaw, it was a psychological one, a cultural one, a systemic one. People had invested blind faith into something that was still learning to understand the sky. The silent wars hidden behind software. We imagine nuclear weapons as explosive, loud, fiery things. But the real war, the war that nearly ended everything, happened quietly, inside lines of code. A misinterpreted sensor reading, a poorly calibrated optical filter, a flawed algorithm that classified sunlight as heat, a system that elevated false positives instead of dismissing them. These tiny mistakes, invisible to the world, came together to form a perfect storm. No bombs, no soldiers, just logic errors wrapped in urgency. It shows something profound about the Cold War. The most powerful weapons were not the missiles, but the assumptions. Assumptions that machines knew better. Assumptions that algorithms could replace intuition. Assumptions that automation removed risk rather than multiplying it. But on September 26, 1983, those assumptions cracked open. The quiet lesson of the flawed system. There is something strangely calming in the realization that the world does not run on perfect systems. It runs on people. Imperfect, thoughtful, hesitant, intuitive human beings who can see beyond the surface. The Oko system saw danger. Petrov saw possibility. The Oko system followed its programming. Petrov followed his judgment. The ecosystem was built to protect. Petrov protected the world from the system itself. And perhaps the most calming truth of all is this: the world survived not because technology succeeded, but because a human being refused to surrender his own understanding. Section 4. The man who stood between two worlds. Before the alarms, before the red lights, before the computer declared with chilling certainty that missiles were on their way, Stanislav Petrov was simply a man finishing a quiet cup of tea. This section steps away from the technology and the tension of the bunker. It is about the human being who carried the weight of the world without even realizing it. A man who understood mistrust, who had lived through contradictions, who saw complexity where others saw orders. The night he made the most important decision of the 20th century, Stanislav Petrov brought into the bunker something no machine could imitate: a lifetime of experience that taught him how to think, not just how to follow. A childhood formed in the shadows of war. Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov was born in the aftermath of destruction. His early childhood in Vladivostok was shaped not by stories of heroism, but by stories of uncertainty. Families lost, fathers missing, towns scarred by conflict. His own father was a fighter pilot who served in World War II, and though Petrov heard tales of bravery, he also saw the quieter truth. War took things from people long after the fighting stopped. From a young age, Petrov learned to distrust simple explanations. The world was not made of one truth, but many overlapping ones. Adults whispered things behind closed doors. Newspapers said one thing, neighbors said another. Reality was always more complicated than it pretended to be. This early exposure to ambiguity became the foundation of his character. Without knowing it, he was developing the skill that would later save the world: the ability to pause in the space between certainty and doubt. The reluctant soldier. Unlike many military officers who climbed ranks through ambition, Petrov had not dreamed of becoming a figure of authority. He loved mathematics, logic, and engineering. Numbers made sense in ways people rarely did. But in the Soviet Union, the line between civilian and military roles often blurred. He entered the Air Defense Forces not because he desired power, but because he was good at solving problems. His instructors noticed something peculiar about him. While others rushed to conclusions, Petrov lingered over details. While others tried to impress with quick answers, he asked questions instead. Once, when presented with a flawed radar exercise, he stopped the drill entirely and asked, why would an enemy approach from this angle? What purpose would it serve? The room fell silent. No one had asked why before, only how. This habit of questioning didn't make him popular, but it made him respected. He wasn't emotional. He wasn't impulsive. He simply refused to mistake procedure for truth. His commanders called him analytical. His peers called him strange. But history would call him necessary. A life caught between duty and disillusionment, Petrov was a paradox, loyal to the system, yet distrustful of it. Obedient in uniform, but skeptical in thought. A military officer who believed more in logic than in ideology, He knew the system he served was both powerful and flawed. He had seen machines break. He had seen officers panic. He had seen bureaucracy bury inconvenient truths. He also understood something few dared admit. The Soviet Union was terrified of making the wrong move. This fear ran through every hallway, every briefing room, every command center. It shaped policies, designed machines, and justified secrecy. Fear, not aggression, was the quiet fuel behind the arms race. And fear is not a good advisor. Petrov knew this, even if he couldn't say it aloud. The quiet burden of being the right person. On September 26, 1983, Petrov wasn't even supposed to be on duty. He was filling in for someone else. A simple schedule change, just one small alteration, had placed him in the most critical seat on Earth. What made this so extraordinary is that very few officers in the Soviet Air Defense Forces had his skeptical mind. Many would have followed protocol instantly, reporting the satellite detection without hesitation. Petrov's presence that night was not fate. It was not destiny. It was something simpler, and perhaps more profound. It was the result of a lifetime of experiences that shaped him into someone who could resist the pressure of certainty. The world didn't need a hero that night. It needed someone who knew how to think. His marriage, his mother, and the weight of quiet responsibility. Shortly before the incident, Stanislav's wife, Raisa, had been diagnosed with cancer. It was a long and painful struggle that slowly drained the warmth from their home. He rarely spoke of it at work, but colleagues noticed the fatigue in his eyes. He knew what it meant to lose someone. He knew what it meant to watch life fade, day by day, quietly, relentlessly. And perhaps, though he never said it, this taught him to value life differently. When you've seen how fragile a single life is, you cannot casually accept the possibility of losing millions. During the long night shifts in the bunker, when the fluorescent lights buzzed and the air smelled like metal and stress, he often thought of his mother and his wife. Ordinary people. People whose lives were small, but meaningful. People whose futures could vanish because someone, somewhere, pressed the wrong button. So when the alarm sounded that night, Petrov wasn't thinking about ideology. He wasn't thinking about politics. He wasn't thinking about power. He was thinking about life, real, fragile, human life. How his mind worked in the moment of truth. When the screen flashed, launch, Petrov didn't react like a soldier trained to obey. He reacted like a thinker trained to evaluate. He asked himself questions faster than most people could form a single thought. Why only a few missiles? Why no radar confirmation? Why no pattern consistent with real attack strategy? Why would the US initiate an apocalypse with such a small strike? His brain sifted through every detail, comparing logic to possibility, strategy to common sense. Others in the room waited, some in fear, some in confusion, some trusting the machine completely. But Petrov stood in a space no algorithm could understand. the space where human judgment defies the mechanical certainty of data. He didn't know the missiles were false. He simply knew they didn't make sense. That was enough. And because of that, the world kept turning. The man, not the uniform, saved the world. When people hear the story of Petrov, they often imagine a heroic figure in a shining uniform, resolute and dramatic. But in reality, he was tired. He was frustrated. He was stressed. He was human. And that humanity, flawed, emotional, thoughtful, was what saved everything. He didn't act because he was a commander. He didn't act because he was brave. He didn't act because he trusted himself more than the system. He acted because he understood something astonishingly simple. Machines can signal danger, but only humans can interpret it. Section 5. The alarm that shook the earth. There are moments in history that seem so enormous, so heavy with consequence, that the world feels as if it suddenly inhales and forgets to breathe again. The night of September 26, 1983, was one of those moments. Inside a dimly lit bunker called Serpukhov 15, buried deep beneath the forest south of Moscow, a sound tore through the stale, recycled air, a sound that every man in that room had been trained to fear, but none had ever expected to hear in reality. A single alarm, shrill, absolute, unmistakable. The missile alert had activated. It began not with chaos but with silence, the kind of silence that expands inside the human mind when it tries and fails to process what it's seeing. Every pair of eyes snapped toward the giant screen hanging above the room. Every heart beat once, twice, then stumbled into a faster rhythm. The screen glowed with a simple, terrible message. Launch detected. A single American missile, then another, and another, and finally a fifth. 5 bright markers ascending across the digital horizon, surrounded by glowing borders that signaled the highest possible level of threat. 100% certainty of attack. This was the moment the bunker had been built for. But no one, not even the most rigid, most protocol-bound officers, truly believed they would ever face it. The command room, a place built for calm, not for chaos. The walls were lined with panels of buttons, lights, and switches that hummed softly under tired fingers. The men on duty were experienced, disciplined, and used to stress. But this was different. Some stiffened instinctively, their posture snapping to attention. Others froze, eyes wide, unsure whether to move or hold still. One young officer whispered a single word under his breath, a word no manual ever mentioned. Bože, God. The giant main display flickered as computers processed the satellite data. A red stripe slid across the panel. A timer began counting down. If this was real, they had less than 30 minutes before the first warheads would strike Moscow. 29, 28, 27. Every number was a heartbeat. What makes an alarm like this so terrifying? Cold War alarms weren't like the emergency alerts we know today. They weren't simply warnings. They were decisions. Decisions embedded inside sound. The bunker had drilled for years on exactly what to do. Step 1. Confirm the warning. Step 2. Report to superiors. Step 3. The Kremlin decides whether to launch Soviet missiles in retaliation. There was no step 4. There was no reset button. There was no turning back. In the Cold War world, alarms didn't just inform, they demanded. A single mistake could mean nuclear winter. A single hesitation could mean losing the ability to respond. That is why the alarm was designed to be unmistakable, impossible to ignore, impossible to misinterpret. Its piercing cry was engineered to penetrate the mind, override fear, and activate training. But Stanislav Petrov was not built like the system around him. He didn't obey sounds. He listened to them, the psychological shock of certainty. The most terrifying part was not the alarm itself. It was the word the computer displayed beneath it. High confidence. This meant the satellite system was not guessing. It was not unsure. It was not cautious. It was declaring, absolutely, that the United States had launched a nuclear-first strike. It only took one missile, properly placed, to wipe out a city. 5 could cripple an entire country. The computer was telling Petrov, "This is war." But Petrov felt something else. Something colder. Something deeper. Something the machine could not compute. It was too perfect. Too clean. Too symmetrical. Too easy. Real attacks, he knew, would involve dozens, if not hundreds, of missiles. No serious strategist would risk everything on a tiny salvo of 5. And yet the computer insisted. Its certainty glowed across the screens like an accusation. Petrov stared at the display and felt a small, electric sensation crawl down his spine. Not fear, intuition. The room divided. While Petrov stood thinking, the officers around him began splitting into 2 psychic camps. Camp 1. Trust the machine. These men pointed to procedures, highlighted the accuracy rate of the satellite systems, reminded each other that false alarms were statistically unlikely, and repeated phrases they had been drilled to say. Camp 2. Trust the commander. These were the men who watched Petrov instead of the screens. They sensed he was calculating, analyzing, resisting panic. They waited for him to act. One officer approached him quietly. "Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, what are your orders?" Petrov didn't answer immediately. He kept staring at the screen, jaw clenched, eyebrows drawn low. Another officer stepped forward, more nervous, voice shaking slightly. "Sir, we must report. Protocol says." Petrov raised a hand. It wasn't an order. It wasn't forceful. It was just quiet, but firm enough to stop the young man mid-sentence. The room fell silent again. The only sound was the mechanical heartbeat of the computers. The countdown and the pressure. 20 minutes left. Then 19. Then 18. In 18 minutes, the world could end. A strange sensation settled over the bunker. Not panic, anticipation, as if watching storm clouds gather, but not knowing yet if they would break. Petrov could feel the weight of dozens of eyes on him. He knew he was supposed to follow procedure. He knew the system expected him to report the alert as a confirmed attack. He knew the Kremlin would almost certainly respond by launching their own missiles. Millions of lives, billions, the planet itself, all condensed into one decision, one moment, one human mind. And that mind was his, the emotional reality no protocol could prepare him for. Petrov wasn't thinking about geopolitics, military doctrine, or the history books. He wasn't thinking about Khrushchev or Kennedy or Reagan's recent speeches. He wasn't thinking about ideology. He was thinking about his wife. He was thinking about his mother. He was thinking about the people, asleep in their apartments above ground. He was thinking about how strangely quiet the world must be at that precise moment. Millions of lives continuing normally, unaware that everything might end within the hour. It struck him that the alarm was the loudest sound on earth that night, and yet no one outside that room could hear it. The decisive moment, a human against a machine. Another officer whispered, "Comrade Petrov, what do we do?" Petrov exhaled slowly and allowed his eyes to soften, just slightly. He heard the alarm again. This time, it didn't sound like authority. It sounded like noise. Noise pretending to be certainty. Noise pretending to be truth. Noise pretending to be fate. And in that moment, something inside him settled. He trusted his mind more than the machine. He trusted logic more than fear. He trusted humanity more than algorithms. He lowered his hand, turned to the duty log, and wrote, "False alarm," not because he knew, but because he understood. Section 6. The moment the alarm screamed, the night the world tilted toward the edge, and one man refused to fall with it. There are moments in history when time seems to hold its breath. Moments when the world stands balanced on a razor's edge, quiet and unsuspecting, unaware that everything, every life, every dream, every future hangs in the hands of one human being. For most of us, these moments happen far away, inside places we never see, inside rooms we cannot enter, behind doors guarded by layers of secrecy. But on the night of September 26th, 1983, that moment occurred inside a dimly lit bunker south of Moscow, and the man standing at its center was Stanislav Petrov. This was the moment his story was born, and this was the moment the world came closer to ending than almost anyone alive today realizes. The bunker that never slept, the Serpukhov 15 Command Center, had a pulse of its own, steady, mechanical, unblinking. Every screen hummed. Every console glowed. Every soldier moved with rehearsed precision. This underground complex existed for one purpose only: to detect the beginning of a nuclear attack on the Soviet Union. The Cold War had conditioned everyone inside those walls to expect it. Maybe tomorrow, maybe next year, maybe tonight. The machines didn't deal in fear or hesitation. They calculated, they analyzed, they reported. But the people were different. They understood what the blinking of a single icon could lead to. The turning of keys, the pressing of buttons, the opening of missile silos across continents, and the unstoppable chain of destruction that would follow. That night, Stanislav Petrov sat at the very heart of this system, the officer responsible for verifying incoming threats. He wasn't supposed to make decisions, just to follow protocol. But fate rarely respects protocol. The alarm that broke the silence. It happened in an instant. One moment, the bunker buzzed with the monotony of routine. The next, the room was pierced by a shrill, metallic scream, the sound of the maximum alert, the one alarm no one ever wanted to hear. A red light flashed. A single, horrifying word pulsed across the central screen. Launch. According to the Soviet early warning satellite system, an American missile had been fired. A real one. A nuclear one. The room froze. Every head turned toward Petrov. Every breath caught in the throat. The protocol was painfully simple. Confirm the detection. Pass the report up the chain. Prepare for counterstrike. It was a system built on automation, built on the assumption that computers do not lie. Tonight, the system said the apocalypse had begun, but Petrov's stomach twisted. Something felt off. He stared at the data, at the readings, at the satellite telemetry. It didn't make sense. Why would the US launch only one missile? Why not dozens, hundreds, thousands? A real nuclear attack would not start with just a single spark. It would start with the entire sky being set on fire. But the screens were certain. The alarms blared, and the eyes of the entire crew were locked onto the man who had to decide whether the world should believe the machine. Then the impossible happened again. Before Petrov could even deliver his doubts, the system pulsed once more. Another missile. Then another, and another, and another. 5 separate U.S. ICBMs were now shown streaking toward the Soviet Union. 5 was not 1. 5 made hesitation dangerous. 5 looked like the beginning of a coordinated strike. His deputy officers were trembling. One whispered, "Comrade Lieutenant Colonel, this is a real launch. We must report it." Petrov's heart hammered in his chest. If he was wrong, if even one missile was real, inaction meant millions of Soviet citizens would die. If he was right, action could trigger a nuclear retaliation that would destroy not only the United States, but Europe, Asia, and eventually the entire Northern Hemisphere. This was not just a choice. It was a paradox racked in terror. He wiped sweat from his forehead. He listened to the alarms. He stared again at the data that seemed all too clean, all too perfect.
And in the middle of this chaos, something inside him whispered, "This is wrong. The system is wrong."
He didn't know why he believed it. He couldn't prove it. He had no way to verify it. But his intuition, sharper than any satellite, was screaming louder than the alarms. He took a breath that felt like it weighed the entire world. Then he made the most important choice in modern history. He told his superiors, "This is a false alarm," and the world unknowingly stepped back from the edge of absolute annihilation. The silence after the storm. Minutes passed, long, suffocating, unbearable minutes. If real missiles were inbound, sirens in cities would soon begin wailing. Radars would detect impacts. Communications would collapse. The end would announce itself. But nothing happened. Nothing at all. The world outside that bunker continued to spin peacefully. People slept in their homes. Children dreamed. Birds nested in trees. Life carried on as if the clock had never stopped ticking. Inside the bunker, Petrov finally let out the breath he had been holding for far too long. He had been right. And because he trusted his own judgment more than a multi-billion-dollar system, he had prevented the largest and most irreversible tragedy imaginable. What no one knew at the time, later investigations would uncover the source of the false alarm. Sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds had tricked the satellite's infrared sensors. It was an error no one had predicted, one that should have been impossible. But on that night, the impossible happened 5 times in a row. If anyone else had been sitting in Petrov's chair, someone stricter, someone more obedient, someone less analytical, the world would be unrecognizably different today. Our cities would be ashes, our oceans poisoned, our skies dark. Civilization itself might never have recovered. But none of that happened, because one man, not powerful, not famous, not celebrated, chose to listen to his conscience rather than the cold, mechanical certainty of a machine. And that choice became one of the most important in all of human history. Section 7. The Weight of a Secret Hero. What it means to save the world and tell no one. In stories, the hero always stands in the spotlight. Crowds cheer, flags wave. History books declare their names in bold letters. Songs are written, statues are built, and their greatness becomes part of the collective memory of the world. But real life is different. In real life, sometimes the greatest hero walks home alone in the dark, unnoticed, uncelebrated, carrying the knowledge of what they did like an invisible stone in their chest. And no story reflects that quiet truth more deeply than the story of Stanislav Petrov. Because after he saved the world, he told no one, not his wife, not his children, not even his closest friends. He simply went home, and the world kept turning, unaware of how close it had come to ending, unaware of the man who had prevented it. The long walk after the longest night. When Petrov's shift finally ended in the early hours of the morning, he stepped outside into the cool air. The sun had not yet risen. The sky was still a deep, velvety blue.
carrying the final whispers of night. For most people, mornings were a time of routine and calm. But Petrov emerged from the bunker, carrying something no human being should ever have to experience.
The knowledge that he had been responsible for the fate of the world. And the strange, almost surreal part was this. Life outside looked completely normal. Cars drove past. Birds chirped. People walked to work. The earth rotated just as it always had. No one knew that hours earlier, 5 false alarms had almost triggered the largest nuclear counterstrike in history. No one knew that their ordinary morning existed only because Petrov had refused to press the next step. He later said that as he walked home, he felt empty. Not heroic, not triumphant, just drained, as if the night had taken something from him that he could never get back. He wanted to talk to someone, anyone, but he couldn't. Everything was classified, locked behind silence, buried beneath secrecy. So he simply went home, a secret he couldn't share. His wife, Raisa, was waiting for him. She noticed something was wrong, but Petrov only shrugged it off. He couldn't tell her he had prevented a nuclear war. He couldn't explain why his hands were shaking, or why his eyes looked hollow. All I did, he later recalled, was drink some tea and try to sleep. Imagine that. You prevent the annihilation of millions, maybe billions, of people. And then you quietly sit down in your kitchen, take a small sip of tea, and attempt to rest, knowing that no one will ever understand the weight sitting inside your mind. There were no celebrations, no awards, no recognition. There was only silence. The heavy shadow of doubt. In the days that followed, Petrov replayed the moment over and over again in his head. What if he had been wrong? What if the missiles had been real? What if his intuition, the thing he relied on instead of cold protocol, had cost lives? He knew the truth now, of course. He had been right. His choice had been the only correct one. But the human mind is not a machine. Even when we know we made the right choice, we still imagine the alternate versions, the darker outcomes, the consequences that could have been. Petrov carried that weight, quietly, alone. His superiors conducted investigations. They questioned everything. They demanded explanations. And while they never openly condemned him, they didn't praise him either. In fact, they criticized his paperwork, his formatting, his interpretation of protocol, as if to punish him for relying on judgment instead of obedience. He wasn't rewarded. He wasn't honored. He wasn't even thanked. It was as though the system couldn't afford to admit how close it had come to disaster. So instead of celebrating him, it buried the event. Petrov said it himself years later. I was made a scapegoat for the system's flaws. He saved the world, and in return the world ignored him. A hero without a pedestal. Why didn't the Soviet government celebrate him? The answer is simple, but tragic. Recognizing his heroism meant admitting their billion-dollar early warning system had failed catastrophically. It meant admitting the Soviet Union had been minutes from launching nuclear retaliation based on a computer error. It meant admitting the unthinkable. And governments do not like to admit their weakness, especially not during the Cold War.
So Petrov remained invisible. He kept working. He kept living. He kept carrying the memory of that night, like a shadow that stretched behind him, unseen by others, but impossible for him to escape. The world he had saved moved on, unaware it owed him anything at all. The quiet toll on his life. Years went by. Petrov's life was not filled with luxury, rewards, or honor. He retired early, partly due to stress, partly due to the immense strain that night had placed on him.
His superiors still didn't acknowledge what he had done.
Meanwhile, conflict continued around the globe. New weapons were built, new threats emerged, and the Cold War rumbled on.
But Petrov, now living in a small apartment outside Moscow, watched the world with a quiet, almost meditative sense of detachment.
He had already seen how close humanity could come to destruction. The daily news seemed trivial compared to the night he had lived through, when his wife died years later.
He slipped even more into the background of life.
He lived modestly, quietly, unseen. The man who saved the world was living a life no different from millions of ordinary people, paying bills, cooking simple meals, watching old television shows, and waiting for time to pass. And still, he spoke of his decision with humility, even reluctance. He didn't consider himself a hero. He never sought attention, and he often dismissed praise by saying, "I was just doing my job." But the truth is deeper. He wasn't following his job. He was going against it. And that act of courage changed everything. The hero the world would eventually discover. For almost 2 decades, no one outside the Soviet military knew what had happened. No one knew about the false alarms. No one knew about the near launch. And no one knew that Petrov had prevented nuclear war. His story remained classified until 1998, when a retired general published his account.
And suddenly, after 15 years of total silence,
the world realized that a single human being had saved it without ever asking for thanks. Journalists traveled to meet him. Documentaries were made. Awards were finally given, some from the United Nations, some from humanitarian organizations, some from private donors. But by then, Petrov was an old man, and his recognition, while touching, arrived long after the moment had mattered. Still,
when he was asked how it felt to have the world finally acknowledge him,
he gave a small smile and answered quietly, "I don't feel like a hero. I was just the right person at the right time." But of course, that isn't how history works. Sometimes the right person at the right time is a hero, and sometimes that hero is a lonely man walking home at dawn, carrying a burden the world will never fully understand.
Section 8. The day the world learned his name, how a hidden truth finally emerged from the shadows. For 15 years, Stanislav Petrov lived in complete anonymity. No medals, no press, no applause. He simply remained a quiet, retired officer living on a modest pension in a small apartment outside Moscow. The world he had saved carried on without ever realizing what had happened on that September night in 1983. New technologies were invented. New conflicts rose and faded. Countries dissolved, alliances shifted, and the Cold War slowly began to thaw. And still, the truth slept, buried deep inside classified Soviet archives. Then, in 1998, it finally woke up. But the way it came to light wasn't dramatic. There was no declassification ceremony, no government announcement. It happened almost casually, sparked by a single conversation between former military officials who no longer had anything to hide. One man decided it was time the world knew the truth, and that one decision changed everything. The first whisper of a forgotten hero. The story began with General Yuri Vutintsev, the former commander of the Soviet Missile Defense Forces. Retired, older, and no longer bound by the same political pressures, he wrote his memoirs, a simple recounting of his career, filled with technical details, reflections, and memories of key events. In those pages, he casually mentioned something astonishing. A lieutenant colonel had once prevented an accidental nuclear retaliation based on a false computer alarm. Nothing more. No name, no praise, no deep analysis. Just a brief description of a moment that could have ended the world. Journalists in Russia and Europe were stunned. They had never heard of such an incident. So they began digging, asking questions, following the tiny trail of breadcrumbs left behind in Vutintsev's book. Finally, after tracing old documents and searching through old military rosters, they found him, Stanislav Yevgrafovich Petrov. And when reporters first knocked on his apartment door, Petrov didn't understand why they cared. Why were foreign journalists seeking him out? Why were they asking about a night he had spent years trying to forget? He didn't know that his quiet act of bravery was about to become global news. The world reacts with shock and gratitude. When the story broke, it spread like wildfire. Television channels ran emergency documentaries. Newspapers wrote front-page articles. Scholars debated what would have happened if Petrov had followed protocol. People around the world asked the same question. How close were we to nuclear war? The answer was chilling. Closer than anyone had ever dared to imagine. Within weeks, millions of people knew his name. The man who once quietly drank tea after saving the world was suddenly recognized as one of the most important figures of the 20th century. But Petrov didn't celebrate. He wasn't comfortable with all the attention. He didn't enjoy interviews, cameras, or praise. He often answered questions reluctantly, softly, or with an embarrassed shrug. He said things like, "I don't know why people think I'm a hero. I just did what I had to do." It wasn't an act of bravery. It was an act of logic. But the world disagreed, because logic alone could not explain what he had done. Most people, sitting in his chair, under that kind of pressure, would have followed the rules. Petrov didn't, and that made all the difference. Awards from around the globe. Recognition soon began pouring in. He received humanitarian awards from the United Nations. He was honored in New York City. He was given a German Media Prize, previously awarded to Nelson Mandela and the Dalai Lama. He met global leaders, filmmakers, and peace advocates. Some awards came with money, but Petrov never spent it on luxury. He lived the rest of his life modestly, preferring quiet days to international fame. One reporter asked him, "What did you do after saving the world?" Petrov smiled and said, I went back to work the next day. That answer told the world everything about him. He was a man who never sought recognition, only to do the right thing. The world wanted a hero. He wanted peace. Something unusual happened once Petrov became known worldwide. People wrote to him. Thousands of letters arrived from every continent. Children sent drawings. Teachers sent essays. Parents wrote heartfelt messages of gratitude. People said things like, "Because of you, my family is alive. You saved my future children. You saved all of us." Those letters touched him more deeply than any award. He kept many of them. He read them slowly, as though absorbing the warmth each one carried. But Petrov still avoided the spotlight whenever he could. He did not like cameras. He did not like interviews. He sometimes declined invitations to ceremonies. He wasn't trying to be mysterious. He simply didn't feel comfortable being seen as a savior. He once said, "I am not a hero. I was in the right place at the right time." But the world knew better. A truth too big for one man to carry. For decades, Petrov carried the memory of that night alone. No one praised him. No one thanked him. No one even knew what he had done. And suddenly, millions of people wanted to celebrate him. It was overwhelming, humbling, a strange reversal of a destiny he never asked for. But as journalists listened to his interviews, they realized something. Petrov still carried the emotional weight of that night. He had seen the fragility of human existence in a way few people ever do. He had watched the world's fate balance on a knife edge. He had felt the crushing responsibility of making an impossible decision. And even decades later, that memory lived inside him, like a shadow. Saving the world had changed him, but being recognized for it helped him heal. He finally understood that what he had done mattered, not just historically, but emotionally, spiritually, and morally. People cared. People were grateful. People were alive because of him. After years of silence, he was no longer alone. A legacy begins to take shape. With the story now public, scholars began studying the event. Peace activists used Petrov's actions as an example of how humanity can override destructive systems. Filmmakers created documentaries about his life. One of the most famous was titled, "The Man Who Saved the World." In it, Petrov appears humble, thoughtful, sometimes even sad, but always profoundly human. He didn't play the role of a hero. He didn't pretend to carry wisdom or moral superiority. He was simply a man who made a decision that night based on what he felt was right. And ironically, that humility made him an even greater hero. A simple man, a global impact. By the time the world discovered Stanislav Petrov, he was already retired, already older, already quiet in his lifestyle. But the world embraced him anyway. He once said, "I don't know if I saved the world, but I know I didn't want to start a war." Whether he liked it or not, his choice had created a legacy that would outlive him. A legacy of calm judgment. a legacy of human intuition, a legacy of choosing peace over protocol, a legacy of one man stopping the unthinkable. And all of it happened because on one silent night in 1983, he trusted his humanity more than the machines around him. Section 9. After the headlines faded, how Stanislav Petrov faced a world that finally knew his name. When the newspapers stopped printing his story and the interview requests slowly faded, Stanislav Petrov found himself in a strange new chapter of life, one that was quieter, but not quite the same as before. Fame had come late, unexpectedly, and without his permission. He never sought it, he never planned for it, and he certainly never used it to change his lifestyle. But something inside him had changed. After decades spent carrying the memory of 1983 in silence, he now lived in a world where people acknowledged it. And that acknowledgement, subtle, soft, and universal, shifted something fundamental in his heart. The man who once sat alone in a dark command room now lived with the quiet awareness that millions of people were alive because of him. A life returned to normal, almost. Once the wave of attention passed, Petrov returned to the same apartment where he had spent most of his adult life. It was modest, a few rooms, old wallpaper, a simple kitchen table, a television, and stacks of letters sent by grateful strangers from across the globe. He spent his days reading, listening to radio broadcasts, drinking tea, and tending to the small routines of everyday life. He didn't want luxury. He didn't want recognition. He wanted normalcy. And yet, normalcy couldn't quite erase what he had experienced. Not just on the night he saved the world, but in the years that followed. Because once you become known as the man who prevented nuclear war, you never fully go back to being invisible. People still found him. Students wrote to him. Historians visited him. Documentary makers knocked on his door. Most days, he answered kindly. Some days, he was too tired. And once in a rare while, he would talk at length, slowly, calmly, choosing each word with care. The cost of carrying the truth. As interviews revealed, Petrov had not left that September night behind. He didn't have nightmares, but he had memory shadows, heavy, persistent thoughts that drifted back to him when he least expected them. The red warning lights, the sirens, the computer screen announcing launch, the pressure to retaliate. The knowledge that billions of lives depended on him acting fast. Even decades later, the memory felt unreal to him. He once said, "I still don't know how my heart didn't stop." People imagined heroism as loud and dramatic. But for Petrov, heroism was quiet, lonely, uncertain. A moment of calm in a storm no one else knew was raging. And the aftermath wasn't easy. He had faced criticism from his own superiors. He had been ignored by his own government. He had lost opportunities for promotion. He had carried guilt for breaking protocol. He had spent years wondering if he made a mistake believing the alert was false. Only later, when the truth came out, did he finally feel the weight lift. He learned that he had been right. The detection system was faulty. He had acted with more accuracy than the billion-dollar machines he was supposed to trust. For the first time, he felt relief. Not pride, not triumph, just relief. A world that remembered when his own homeland did not. One of the saddest and most striking aspects of Petrov's life was the difference between how the world treated him and how his own country did. In the West, he was celebrated. In Russia, he was largely ignored. At times, this bothered him. Other times, he shrugged it off. He often said, "My country wanted silence. The world wanted truth." When foreign journalists asked if he was disappointed that Russia never honored him, he answered, "I didn't do it for medals." And he meant it. But the irony remained. The world recognized him as one of the great peacekeepers of the 20th century. Yet he lived out his later years more like a quiet, retired engineer than a celebrated global figure. Sometimes the world's greatest heroes are those who live unnoticed in their own lifetime. A man unchanged by fame. One of the most remarkable things about Petrov was how fame didn't change him. He didn't spend award money on travel or luxury. He didn't try to become a public figure or political voice. He didn't write a book or start a foundation. He remained who he had always been, a careful thinker, a calm presence, a man who preferred simple surroundings, someone who valued peace over spotlight. When asked how he wanted to be remembered, he said, "As a man who didn't want to start a war." People expected a more dramatic answer, but true heroes rarely speak dramatically. They speak plainly, because their actions already said everything. Unexpected friendships and quiet moments of joy. Though Petrov avoided the spotlight, life after the story's release brought him something unexpected: human connection. Filmmakers who worked with him became lifelong friends. Foreign visitors brought small gifts, tea, local sweets, rare books. Children wrote letters that made him smile with genuine softness. A famous moment occurred during the filming of The Man Who Saved the World. He visited New York and met people who had written to him for years. One woman hugged him and said, "If not for you, my grandchildren would not exist." He looked stunned. He didn't know what to say. He simply held her hand and nodded, as though absorbing the gravity of her words. These small interactions warmed him more than awards ever could. For a man who lived most of his life in the shadows, being seen, truly seen, was a gift. The quiet decline of a global hero. As the years passed, Petrov's health began to decline. He grew thinner. His hair grayed. His hands shook slightly when he held papers or accepted letters. But his mind remained sharp. He still remembered the details of the incident with astonishing clarity. He still cared deeply about peace. He still believed nuclear weapons should never be used by any country. When he watched international tensions rise on the news, he would sigh softly and say, "People forget too easily." He had seen how fragile peace truly was. Most people never had. A life that quietly changed history. Petrov lived in modest solitude until 2017. He passed away quietly, without immediate public announcement. It wasn't until months later that global media learned he was gone. But by then, millions of people knew his story.
Teachers taught it in classrooms. Students wrote essays about him. Historians preserved his name in books. Filmmakers immortalized him on screen. And every year, on the anniversary of that night in 1983, countless people remember him as the man who saved the world, not through force, not through politics, not through power, but through calm judgment in a moment of unimaginable pressure. The legacy he left behind is simple and profound. The world is safer when humans choose peace over fear.
Section 10. The Lessons from a Single Night. What Stanislav Petrov's story teaches about humanity, judgment, and peace. The night of September 26, 1983, was a single point in time. Yet its ripple effects continue to echo across the decades, reminding us of the delicate balance between catastrophe and calm. Stanislav Petrov's actions were simple on the surface. He noticed a warning light, analyzed the situation, and decided not to alert the military command. But the depth of his decision, its courage, intelligence, and restraint, offers lessons that extend far beyond the confines of one Soviet command center. The power of individual judgment. Petrov's story is a profound testament to the power of individual judgment. In a system designed for rapid, almost automatic responses, the human element might seem almost redundant. Yet it was precisely this human element that saved the world. He didn't rely solely on technology. He didn't blindly follow protocol. He used reason, experience, and calm intuition to determine that the incoming alert was likely false. This moment highlights something essential about human nature: the capacity for thoughtful, measured judgment under pressure is often more valuable than the fastest reaction. In today's world, where artificial intelligence, automated systems, and instant communication dominate, Petrov's example reminds us that machines, even those designed to protect us, cannot replace the discernment and ethical reasoning of a careful human mind. Calmness as a superpower. The night could have ended differently if Petrov had succumbed to panic. It's easy to imagine a less composed officer seeing the warning lights, letting fear dictate action, and initiating a chain reaction of devastation. Instead, Petrov demonstrated what might be called calm under fire at its highest level. His ability to stay calm was not innate. It was honed through years of disciplined service, experience, and familiarity with high-pressure environments. This calmness allowed him to see the details clearly, weigh probabilities, and make a decision that was rational rather than reactionary. The lesson resonates far beyond military strategy. In business, science, politics, or even personal life, moments of intense pressure often determine the course of events. Those who maintain composure, evaluate evidence carefully, and resist emotional impulsivity are far more likely to make decisions that avert disaster or achieve optimal outcomes. The fragility of technology and systems. Another lesson from Petrov's story is the fragility of technology. Even when it is designed with immense resources and complex programming, the early warning system he relied on, valued in billions of dollars, connected to the fate of millions, was flawed. The system misinterpreted sunlight reflecting off clouds as missile launches. It serves as a cautionary tale for our modern reliance on technology. High-tech systems, no matter how advanced, are not infallible. Human oversight remains indispensable, especially when the stakes are existential. Petrov's decision emphasizes that critical thinking, skepticism, and careful verification are crucial in a world increasingly dominated by automation. The moral weight of choices. Petrov's moment was not merely a technical or strategic decision. It was deeply moral. The consequences of pressing the wrong button were literally unimaginable. The deaths of millions, global devastation, and the potential collapse of civilization. The moral gravity of his decision underscores a fundamental truth. The most profound acts of heroism are often quiet, ethical choices made in isolation, away from applause or recognition. Petrov didn't act for fame, reward, or acknowledgement. He acted because it was the right decision. This speaks to a broader lesson about ethical responsibility. In our own lives, the choices we make, especially those that affect others, carry weight, even if the consequences aren't immediately visible. Integrity, prudence, and moral courage are timeless virtues. Whether one stands before a nuclear console or in everyday life. The unseen impact of heroism. Petrov's heroism was invisible for decades. Few knew about it, and fewer recognized the stakes he faced. Yet, the impact of his actions was monumental. Millions lived, entire nations were spared, and the world narrowly avoided catastrophe. This teaches us that heroism doesn't always require grand gestures or public recognition. Often, the most significant contributions are unseen, uncelebrated, and quietly woven into the fabric of history. Every decision, every act of vigilance, every moment of ethical clarity, no matter how small, can reverberate far beyond our perception. Petrov's story reminds us that ordinary individuals, acting with care and conscience, can shape history in ways that go unacknowledged for years or even decades. The importance of memory and history. Another lesson arises from how the story of September 26, 1983, came to light. For years, Petrov's actions were unknown to the world. Only decades later did historians, journalists, and filmmakers uncover the truth. This underscores the importance of documenting, remembering, and sharing historical events. Moments of quiet heroism, moral courage, and human insight can inspire future generations, but only if they are preserved and communicated. Petrov's story also highlights the fragility of memory and the ease with which crucial lessons can be forgotten if we fail to record them. For societies, this is a reminder to honor and remember not only grand battles and victories, but also the quiet acts that preserve peace, life, and humanity. Hope in the face of global risk. In 1983, the world faced one of its closest brushes with nuclear war since the Cuban Missile Crisis. Yet, the actions of a single man demonstrated that hope and rationality can still prevail, even when humanity is pushed to the edge. Petrov's story is a rare reminder that amid political tension,
international rivalry, and technological uncertainty. Individual human judgment and courage can prevent disaster. For modern audiences, especially in an era marked by climate crises, technological risk, and geopolitical instability, his example encourages belief in the possibility of positive action, even when the odds seem insurmountable. The lasting legacy of Stanislav Petrov. Today, Petrov's legacy continues in multiple forms. Books, documentaries, scholarly articles, and films. Awards like the Dresden Peace Prize and global recognition of his heroism remind us that even the most quiet, unassuming acts of courage eventually find their audience. His life offers a framework for reflection. Calm judgment under pressure is invaluable. Ethical decision-making can save lives. Technology, no matter how sophisticated, requires human oversight. Unseen heroism has lasting significance. Historical memory preserves essential lessons for the future. Petrov's story teaches that humanity's fate often rests not solely on governments, armies, or systems, but on the actions of conscientious individuals, acting with courage, intelligence, and moral clarity. A quiet call to action. As we reflect on Petrov's life and his night of quiet heroism, the broader question arises: how can we emulate this courage in our own lives? Perhaps it isn't about preventing global catastrophe. Perhaps it's about making thoughtful decisions when others are panicked, questioning authority when necessary, balancing risk and responsibility with ethical reasoning, acting with compassion and foresight, even when unnoticed. Stanislav Petrov didn't save the world for recognition. He saved it because he acted with care, clarity, and courage. And in doing so, he left us a model for navigating uncertainty with calm, moral fortitude, and a quiet commitment to life itself.
Section 11. The wider implications of Petrov's night. The story of Stanislav Petrov is often told as a singular tale of heroism. One man, one night, one decision that prevented nuclear catastrophe. But to truly appreciate the depth of his actions, it's essential to explore the wider implications of that night, how it reshaped our understanding of risk, human judgment, and the fragile systems that govern global security. Systems designed to fail under pressure. Petrov's calm assessment of the incoming warning highlights a counterintuitive truth about high-stakes systems. Sometimes they are designed to fail, or at least they are vulnerable under extreme conditions. The Soviet early warning system that Petrov monitored was advanced for its time, designed to detect missile launches and alert command within minutes. Yet, its design assumed perfect input and flawless operation. The system did not account for unusual anomalies, like sunlight reflecting off high-altitude clouds, which is precisely what caused the false alarms that night. This reveals an important lesson for the modern era. No system, no matter how sophisticated, is infallible. Even artificial intelligence, machine learning algorithms, and automated defense protocols depend on accurate data, assumptions, and oversight. Petrov's decision to trust his judgment over the machine highlights the enduring importance of human intervention in high-stakes scenarios. The fragility of peace. The world in 1983 was already on edge. Political tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union had reached one of their coldest points, amplified by the deployment of nuclear weapons in Europe and the fear of a preemptive strike. Petrov's moment reminds us of how fragile peace can be in a context dominated by fear, miscommunication, and imperfect technology. If Petrov had acted differently, if he had followed protocol without question, the Cold War might have escalated into a global nuclear conflict in the span of minutes. This underscores a sobering truth. The stability of the world often depends on the discretion and judgment of individuals, rather than the robustness of treaties or technology alone. Human judgment versus bureaucratic procedure. In military and government systems, procedures and protocols are designed to ensure order and predictability. Yet, Petrov's night demonstrates that strict adherence to protocol can sometimes be more dangerous than flexible judgment. By trusting his instincts and considering the context of the alert, its timing, the unusual behavior of the system, and the broader geopolitical situation, Petrov chose prudence over procedure. This balance between human judgment and bureaucratic structure is crucial not only in military contexts, but in any organization where rapid decisions carry enormous consequences. It raises a critical question. How do we create systems that leverage human intelligence without relying on it entirely? Petrov's actions suggest that the best systems are those that allow human oversight to correct technological errors, rather than forcing humans to follow potentially flawed automatic responses. The psychology of decision-making under extreme pressure. Psychologists and behavioral scientists have studied Petrov's decision extensively, noting how rare it is for someone to maintain clarity and reason under immediate existential threat. Most people, when faced with the possibility of imminent nuclear war, would succumb to panic, confusion, or a rigid reliance on authority. Petrov's ability to remain calm can be attributed to several factors: experience and training. Years of working with high-pressure military systems had prepared him to recognize anomalies. Skepticism. Petrov questioned the system instead of assuming it was infallible. Moral clarity. He understood the consequences of a false alarm, which helped him weigh the potential outcomes carefully. Composure. He was able to resist fear-driven impulses and make a decision grounded in rationality. This combination of skills and traits illustrates how critical emotional regulation and situational awareness are in decision-making processes, where errors can have catastrophic consequences. The ethical dimensions of Petrov's choice. Petrov's decision also provides a compelling case study in ethics. It raises the question: what is the right course of action when following rules may lead to disaster? In many ways, Petrov's night challenges conventional thinking about moral responsibility. Protocol demanded he report the alert, which could have triggered a nuclear response. But the ethical imperative to prevent mass destruction required him to act differently. He chose the higher moral path over blind obedience. This has implications far beyond the Cold War. In fields ranging from medicine to engineering, finance to government, professionals regularly face situations where strict adherence to rules may conflict with ethical responsibility. Petrov's example reminds us that courage, critical thinking, and moral judgment are essential, even when they defy the expectations of authority or bureaucracy. A lesson in humility for leaders. The near catastrophe of 1983 should also serve as a lesson in humility for leaders and policymakers. It demonstrates that even the most powerful nations, with vast military arsenals and complex command structures, are vulnerable to small errors and human misjudgments. Leaders must acknowledge the limits of their systems, the potential for unforeseen anomalies, and the critical importance of empowering individuals to act thoughtfully in moments of crisis. In essence, Petrov's Night is a reminder that humility, caution, and respect for human judgment are invaluable traits in leadership. The ripple effect of one decision, Petrov's actions that night, did not create headlines for years. They were largely unknown to the world until decades later, when journalists and historians began piecing together the story. Yet, the implications of his decision are staggering. By choosing not to report the false alarm, he averted a chain reaction that could have led to nuclear war. This teaches us that the consequences of a single decision, especially in high-stakes contexts, can ripple outward far beyond what we can immediately see. It emphasizes the responsibility inherent in every moment of choice and the potential of an individual to influence history. The importance of recognition and memory. For decades, Petrov received little acknowledgement for his life-saving actions. It wasn't until later that he was celebrated globally, receiving awards like the Dresden Peace Prize and international recognition as a quiet hero. His delayed recognition is a reminder of how easily vital contributions can be overlooked, especially those made without fanfare or self-interest. It stresses the importance of documenting history and honoring acts of courage, ensuring that such stories inspire future generations. Petrov's enduring legacy today. Petrov's Night continues to resonate in discussions about nuclear safety, decision-making, and the limits of technology. His story is a symbol of the power of reason, calm, and ethical courage. It encourages reflection on the systems we build, the decisions we make, and the potential for individuals to shape outcomes even in the face of overwhelming odds. Stanislav Petrov's example endures as a quiet yet profound testament to the fact that sometimes the fate of the world hinges on a single person making the right choice at precisely the right moment.